immediately stakes a claim in the center, aiming to dominate open lines and dictate early development. Developing the knight to a flexible square, preparing for central engagement and potential queenside expansion. Asserting central space, this pawn immediately contests black's flexible knight setup and begins a vigorous pawn structure engagement. Embracing the fianchetto, this move sets the stage for a dynamic kingside battle and potential long-range bishop pressure. Securing the bishop's diagonal preemptively, a touch of spatial control. Solidifying the pawn chain, c6 aims to support d5 and prepare for piece development on the queenside, a classic king's Indian setup. Solidifying the center and preparing for kingside castling, this bishop now eyes the long diagonal, a cornerstone for future queenside pressure. Challenging central control, black immediately fights for space and aims to disrupt white's intended pawn structure. Opening this central file immediately offers chances to pressure black's queenside pawns and create dynamic counterplay. Opening the center file grants immediate counterplay, challenging white's pawn mass and potentially liberating the bishop. Developing the knight to its natural outpost solidifies control over central squares and prepares for castling, all while keeping options open for the queen's bishop. Developing the bishop to g7 completes black's kingside fianchetto, perfectly mirroring white's setup and establishing a powerful long-range diagonal. This piece, now unleashed, exerts pressure along the h8-a1 diagonal, indirectly challenging white's central control and preparing for potential queenside expansion or a kingside pawn storm later. Securing central presence with the knight, white aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and exploit potential weaknesses. This knight maneuver, steering away from the initial central skirmish, strategically repositions to influence squares vital for both attack and defense, hinting at a desire to control key diagonals and files later in the game. A subtle yet significant advance, this piece placement creates tactical possibilities and forces black to carefully consider their defensive setup, lest their pawn chains become overextended or vulnerable to concentrated pressure. Boldly challenging white's knight, this knight repositioning aims to disrupt white's central control and potentially open lines for black's pieces, creating dynamic imbalances. Strategically repositioning the knight to pressure black's central pawn structure, while simultaneously preparing for potential knight exchanges and reinforcing the e5 square. Exchanging knights now could lead to a slightly less cramped position for black, but it also opens the e-file for white and allows their pieces to develop more freely. Consider if this trade truly simplifies things favorably or just trades one burden for another. Striking at the knight exchange frees up the d-file for potential future pressure and aims to simplify into a more favorable structure where white's central pawns can gain mobility. Sacrificing pawn structure for active piece play, black embraces a slightly doubled pawn on e4, aiming to leverage the newly opened diagonal for the queen and bishop and to challenge white's central control, potentially creating tactical opportunities. Castling here secures the king and prepares to connect the rooks, opening up possibilities along the open files that might soon emerge. Securing the monarch is a paramount concern, and this timely repositioning accomplishes precisely that by tucking the king behind a newly formed pawn shield, simultaneously preparing for potential future kingside advances or defensive maneuvers. Shifting the bishop to the active diagonal, this maneuver creates immediate pressure along the e-file and subtly prepares for a potential kingside expansion, hinting at a long-term strategic battle rather than an immediate tactical skirmish. Re-establishing knight activity after the forced exchange, the black knight aims to re-enter the fray, potentially targeting white's central pawn structure or looking for outposts as the queenside battle begins to take shape. Solidifying the center's control while preparing to expand on the kingside opens up avenues for a strategic build-up, aiming to cramp black's knights and eventually exploit weaknesses on the queenside. Developing the bishop to exert pressure along the long diagonal, preparing to challenge white's central pawn structure and potentially unlock attacking possibilities on the kingside, represents a logical consolidation of black's position. Pivoting the queen to e2 aims to activate the piece, eyeing the weakened e4 pawn and preparing to potentially support a central pawn push or join an attack down the e-file. Asserting pressure on the semi-open c-file, this deployment solidifies black's central influence and prepares for future pawn advances or piece activity along that critical corridor. Securing the c-file with the rook brings immediate pressure, preparing to contest black's occupation and potentially exploit weaknesses along that open corridor, a sensible consolidation of central gains after the pawn exchange. Seeking to activate the queen and eye the c4 pawn, black introduces a new offensive threat, potentially forcing white to defend rather than continue their central pawn expansion. Pivoting the knight to c4 injects immediate tactical pressure, aiming to exploit the potential weakness on d6 and challenging black's control of the center. Black reorients the queen, not to immediately attack, but to prepare for a potential pawn push on e4 or to contest the crucial central squares. Notice how the queen now eyes the c4 knight, subtly increasing the pressure on that square and hinting at a desire to simplify the position or gain central influence. Repositioning the bishop to f1 reclaims central influence, aiming to coordinate with the rook on c1 and potentially eye the d5 pawn. The knight, having been pushed back to the edge, now actively seeks central influence, aiming to disrupt white's queenside setup and eye potential squares like c3 or e3. Rerouting the knight to d2 aims to consolidate the queenside pawn structure and potentially support a future e4 push, while also freeing up the c1 rook for more active duties along the open c-file. Relinquishing the queen here simplifies the position drastically, potentially steering towards an endgame where black's slightly more active pieces could become a factor, although the immediate consequence is a loss of attacking momentum and a clear path for white to consolidate their central presence. The exchange of queens finally clarifies the tactical landscape, and recapturing with the bishop is a logical consolidation, preparing to contest the open c-file and bolster the center's pawn structure. Developing a pawn to f5 immediately seeks to solidify the central structure and create breathing room for the pieces, especially the knight on f6. But it also significantly weakens the light squares around black's monarch, potentially creating targets for white's bishop on e2 and queen. Pivoting the knight to b3 opens a diagonal for the bishop and prepares to contest the c-file, aiming to exploit the potential weakness on the queenside if black's pawns become too advanced. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure now aims to create a robust defense against white's pieces, particularly the knight poised to infiltrate on c4. The bishop now occupies the audacious a6 outpost, a daring placement that immediately challenges black's queenside structure and seeks to disrupt their piece harmony. White is aiming to create persistent pressure on the c-file, potentially forcing concessions or weak squares within black's camp. This move embodies a proactive strategy, preferring active piece play over passive defense, and forces black to make immediate decisions about how to address this new, uncomfortable threat lurking on the flank. Initiating a trade of rooks here is a strategic decision to simplify the position and potentially open lines, but it also sacrifices control of the c-file which white was actively contesting. By exchanging, black's king becomes slightly more exposed in the center as the defender of the d5 pawn is gone. Consider if this simplification truly benefits your pawn structure or king safety in the long run. Reclaiming the open file after the exchange solidifies white's control, setting the stage for a potential queenside expansion or central pressure as the endgame begins to take shape. Repositioning the monarch to a more active square, the king steps out of the shadows, anticipating potential involvement in the unfolding endgame dynamics. Reclaiming central presence, the knight pivots to d2*, a seemingly modest repositioning that nonetheless aims to bolster the queenside and prepare for a potential pawn push on the queenside flank, while also safeguarding the d-pawn should black decide to advance their own on the kingside. The knight aggressively repositions, eyeing the advanced rook and aiming to disrupt white's queenside structure by potentially infiltrating the c2 square. Securing the bishop's outpost on a6 provides crucial square control, anticipating any potential knight maneuvers towards the d5 pawn and limiting black's mobility on the queenside. The rook now endeavors to establish a presence on the open d-file, a vital corridor for exerting pressure and potentially initiating an assault on white's somewhat exposed king. Assailing the knight and forcing a decision on whether to retreat or exchange, this move initiates a critical positional struggle on the queen side, potentially clearing the way for a more active rook presence if black decides to maintain material balance. The knight's bold excursion to d3 directly challenges white's bishop on c4, aiming to disrupt its defensive posture and potentially open lines for black's rooks. This maneuver injects immediate tactical tension into the position, forcing white to decide whether to retreat the bishop, maintain its presence at the cost of a tempo, or even consider a trade that might alter the pawn structure. Black is clearly seeking to activate their pieces and create dynamic possibilities, rather than settle for passive maneuvering. Clearing the path for the rook on the c-file by this capture creates a cleaner structure for white, aiming to exploit the slightly exposed black king and the advanced d-pawn. The unexpected repositioning of the captured pawn to d3 disrupts white's central pawn structure, creating a potential target and offering black newfound space for maneuvering its pieces, particularly the rook on the c-file, or perhaps even opening avenues for queenside expansion if white isn't careful. Clearing that crucial diagonal for the bishop's attack, while simultaneously preparing to challenge the open files with the remaining rook, sets up a dynamic struggle where central control becomes paramount. The rook repositions to the open file, preparing to contest control and potentially support the d-pawn's advance, a critical pawn that has become a significant positional asset. Prioritizing king's safety after the rook exchange, the white monarch relocates to a more secure square, evading potential checks and preparing for future defensive maneuvers. Exchanging the rooks here streamlines the position, transitioning towards a pawn-heavy endgame where black's doubled pawns on the d-file could become targets, but also potentially create a passed pawn if white isn't careful with piece activity. Prying open the b-file, a bold structural alteration, fundamentally transforms the pawn skeleton, creating a potential outpost on c4 and initiating a critical endgame where passed pawns will dominate. Embracing the pawn storm, black lunges forward, aiming to expand on the queenside and potentially create a passed pawn, though this aggressive advance also weakens the queenside pawn structure and could become a target later if white can organize an attack. Shifting the monarch towards the center now prepares for the pawn push on f4, aiming to expand white's territory on the kingside and restrict black's pieces, while also offering the king a safer haven from potential future threats on the central files that might arise. Mobilizing the bishop to d5 aims to secure the central pawn majority and prepare for a potential advance, while also challenging white's bishop on c4 and looking to free the rook from its passive position. Unleashing pawns like a cavalry charge, f3 aims to disrupt black's centralized bishop and secure white's king, yet it also creates a permanent pawn weakness on e3 that could become a target in the ensuing endgame. Preparing to reroute the bishop to a more active square, aiming for either the long diagonal or to support a pawn advance, this maneuver seeks to escape the current passive placement. Initiating a pawn storm on the kingside, this advance aims to pry open lines for white's pieces and disrupt black's bishop's influence. Stepping onto a2, the bishop boldly asserts its presence on the queenside, seeking to disrupt white's now somewhat awkward pawn structure and potentially eye the vulnerable d3 pawn. Opening the central path now creates immediate tension and offers a direct assault on black's doubled pawns, forcing a reaction and potentially activating white's queen for future breakthroughs. Opening up the e-file with this pawn thrust creates dynamic imbalance, potentially transforming a quiet structural advantage into a sharp tactical battle. Sacrificing the bishop here to achieve pawn majority on the queen side is a bold strategic gamble, aiming to create unstoppable passed pawns that will overwhelm black's defenses in the endgame. Seizing a seemingly passive piece for a pawn exchange simplifies the position, potentially offering black a structural advantage in the ensuing endgame due to the advanced passed pawn. Asserting dominion over the b3 square, the bishop now occupies a menacing outpost, stifling any black counterplay on that side and preparing for an eventual push on the queen side. Exploiting the newly opened diagonal, black aggressively pushes the pawn forward, aiming to disrupt white's queenside structure and gain space for its remaining pieces. This bishop retreat is an interesting strategic choice, seemingly allowing black's rook to penetrate, but actually aiming to disrupt the pawn chain and create a safer square for the white king. Gaining a foothold on the queenside with this pawn advance creates immediate pressure, potentially opening lines for the rook and disrupting white's pawn structure while bolstering black's central presence. Gaining a foothold on the queenside is paramount as the king ventures toward the center. A decisive step towards centralizing the monarch, ushering it into a more active role in the looming endgame. Bolstering the central pawn chain, this maneuver prepares to activate the bishop to a more menacing diagonal, eyeing the enemy king's somewhat exposed position. Unlocking the kingside pawn chain's potential requires activating that stranded bishop, which now faces a crucial decision regarding its future mobility. Pawn storming the kingside begins, aiming to pry open lines and exploit the slightly exposed black monarch. Capturing the pawn is a double-edged sword. While it opens a path for the king and can disrupt white's structure, it allows white's g-pawn to advance menacingly, potentially creating passed pawns on the kingside and exposing your monarch further. Pawn structure finally clarifies after repeated exchanges, and this recapture opens the king's defender, the g-pawn, to an attacking role on the open file. Aggressively staking a claim on the kingside, g5 aims to create space for the king and potentially disrupt white's pawn structure. Shifting the king to the center now begins the delicate dance of maneuvering through this complex pawn structure, aiming to reactivate the monarch before the queenside majority becomes truly overwhelming. Asserting kingside presence with the king's advance, this maneuver seeks to mobilize the monarch into the heart of the fray. The king's journey continues, seeking a more secure haven amidst the pawn structure chaos. The king embarks on a daring promenade, seeking the safety of the queenside flank, a stark contrast to its precarious position earlier. Clearing the c-file allows the bishop to penetrate deeper, aiming to support the advancing pawn chain and create a more dynamic setup against the black king. Confronting the advanced passed pawn's dominion, the king reclaims its vital square, preparing to challenge white's bishop for the diagonal's control and to anchor its support structure. Initiating a cautious king repositioning, aiming to secure the monarch from potential pawn advances and open files while subtly preparing for potential endgame maneuvers where king activity becomes paramount. The king's valiant march to the queenside aims to bolster the isolated pawns and find safety, but it walks into a potential bind. The monarch ventures forth, a bold stride into the heart of the board's activity, aiming to escape the stifling pressure and seek active participation in the looming endgame. Repositioning the bishop to this square offers a dual threat, aiming to disrupt white's rook activity on the second rank while simultaneously preparing a potential pawn advance on the queenside. Capturing the pawn fundamentally alters the pawn structure, opening a vital file for your rook and creating a passed pawn on the queenside that demands immediate attention. Seizing the open file with the pawn thrust transforms the queenside into a battleground, forcing white to commit their bishop to a defensive posture. Opening up the bishop to attack the pawn structure on the queenside, this maneuver seeks to disrupt black's intended pawn advances and potentially create weaknesses that can be exploited later. This bishop's return to e5 initiates a subtle maneuver to regain a foothold on the kingside, aiming to create threats or at least exchange itself for white's active knight on a3, simplifying into a more manageable endgame. The bishop retreats not out of fear, but to reposition, eyeing the now open kingside diagonals and preparing to potentially support a pawn push or even offer itself for a crucial tempo later. Unleashing the pawn's potential, this advance on the queenside seeks to disrupt white's consolidated structure and create vital space for black's pieces to maneuver towards the center. The bishop slides to a3, seeking to gain space on the queenside and prepare a breakthrough with the advancing pawns. Pushing that pawn to the second rank unearths a powerful threat, aiming to liberate the rook and force it into a more active position along the newly opened file. Securing the pawn advances the king's security by removing a potential attacker from the queen side, while simultaneously preparing to consolidate the material advantage and march the passed b-pawn towards promotion. The pawn structure now presents a fascinating endgame challenge, with black's bishop no longer able to participate effectively in defending its own remaining pawns after this capture, opening up potential avenues for the white king to infiltrate. Securing the kingside pawn structure now, the plan is to advance it to gain space and restrict black's bishop. Unleashing the king from its defensive shell allows it to participate in the pawn race, aiming to become a formidable force in the approaching climax. Pushing the g-pawn further opens avenues for your king's safety by creating a potential escape square and simultaneously threatening to advance and disrupt black's pawn structure. The bishop now eyes the g7 pawn, a defensive anchor since the opening, potentially creating a fascinating interplay as white's king also seeks safer pastures. Initiating a final pawn storm on the kingside to crack open the structure and create mating threats. Unlocking the potential of that bishop to its full diagonal scope offers a much-needed breath of fresh air, creating opportunities to apply pressure along the h2, b8 diagonal and potentially support the advanced passed pawn on b2. Pioneering a pawn thrust forward ignites a cascade of potential, aiming to unravel the opponent's defensive structure and create new avenues for attack across the board. Unleashing the pawn creates immediate clarity on the kingside, but it also opens the h-file for white's king to potentially exploit later if the g-pawn advances further. The pawn's sacrifice on the h-file opens a clear path to the black king, creating immediate mating threats by activating the g-pawn and the rook on the first rank. The bishop retreats, seeking a more active square on the kingside, but its departure from the d-file allows white's king to finally advance and solidify its central presence. Chasing the opponent's pawns like this, while tempting, often leaves your own king exposed. Focus on consolidating your position and preparing a decisive pawn push to open lines for your remaining pieces. Discovering a clear path for the bishop to disrupt the pawn structure, forcing the king into a defensive posture. The monarch scurries back towards the central safety, attempting to regroup amidst the escalating pawn storm on the queen side. A bold advance, aiming to liberate the bishop and potentially disrupt white's king's safety by creating a pathway for the dark-squared bishop to become active on the queen side. Opening the path to the king side with this advance invites further pawn engagement, potentially weakening white's own structure if not carefully supported, while simultaneously preparing to contest the open files that are now even more critical. Coordinating the bishop with the king's defensive network becomes paramount as we venture deeper into this endgame. Its repositioning aims to support a potential pawn advance or dissuade white's king from infiltrating the queen side. Securing the initiative, the knight dances to the center, aiming to dominate the open diagonals and exploit black's somewhat exposed king. Unleashing the passed pawn here on the open d-file transforms the endgame narrative. Black finally has a concrete attacking thrust, forcing white's pieces to react and potentially creating opportunities for the king or other pawns to advance. King Hunt activated. Forcing the black king into the open is now the primary objective after this forceful check. The king, no longer an untouchable sanctuary, now faces the stark reality of an exposed, vulnerable position, a consequence of abandoning its defensive structure for distant horizons. Liberating the knight from its cramped position on b2 opens up the central files and allows for renewed pressure on black's overextended king.